Let's talk about types of psychological assessments, beginning with self-reports. Obviously, there are problems with self-reports and assessment. For one thing, you're asking people to report about their own attitudes and beliefs and behavior, and they may not be able to do so accurately for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it relies on their memories. One of the most well-known and frequently used self-report assessments is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic, that's with PH, Personality Inventory. Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It is an empirically designed test. It's composed of about 550 true-false questions. And it was essentially designed to distinguish between psychiatric and non-psychiatric populations. It's frequently used today for people who are applying to certain types of sensitive positions or to jobs that require a filter system. Now, the MMPI, I said it was empirically designed. This is important. The authors of the MMPI generated many, many true-false statements. And then working in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they administered that first draft of the test to people at a psychiatric institute, as well as people who were not in that psychiatric institute but came to visit people there. And so they were basically looking for test items that would help distinguish between the two populations, those with psychiatric problems in an institution and those presumably without psychiatric difficulties. So they kept the items that were useful, tossed out the others, generated more true-false items, and administered again to the two populations, keeping those items that were useful and discarding the remainder, generating more. So this is an empirically designed personality assessment. When I said that items that were useful for distinguishing the two populations were kept and others were removed and replaced, I didn't mean individual items that distinguish between the two populations. The questions or the items on the MMPI address a variety of topics, not just those related to psychiatric issues. They have to do with people's attitudes about politics and premarital sex and many, many different topic areas. And the useful items are those that within a subgroup of items distinguish between the two populations. In its original version, the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, was very much criticized. And that's because the test itself was designed using populations from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Truly a wonderful place, but are people from Minneapolis, Minnesota representative from people from around this country or from around the world? Probably not. So it has been revised to have higher external validity. Remember that term? So you should know about the MMPI, know that it's an empirically designed test composed of about 550 true-false questions, and that it's used to distinguish between psychiatric and non-psychiatric populations. The next type of psychological assessment that I want you to know involves projective tests. Now, these are tests that are based on a Freudian concept, the idea that we have self-defense mechanisms. For instance, we may protect ourselves by projecting our own undesirable wishes and desires onto other people. And here the idea is that we're projecting important information about ourselves onto these ambiguous images. In fact, that is the primary characteristic of a projective test, that it uses ambiguous images. So one of the most famous projective tests is the Rorschach ink blot test, and I'm showing you an example of what might be part of a Rorschach test. Here we have an ink blot, and if you were to take the Rorschach ink blot test, then you'd be asked to look at each image say what you see in the image, point to the parts of the image that give rise to your impression, and so on. And the idea is that this is going to reveal your unconscious motivations, wishes, and desires. So looking at this ink blot, um, I personally see two little men with big noses sitting on top of a flower. They're facing each other. Other people in the classroom have told me that they see a moose head or a skull. Um, I've had people tell me they see a uterus. Now, these are all answers for this image that make good sense, that do not violate good form. I think most of us can look at the image and say, okay, I can see that, I can see that, and I can see that. If someone were to say, look at this image and say, I see a little boy weeping in the corner, that does not fit the image. That violates good form. And a clinician who's administering the Rorschach test would take that into account, and along with responses to other of the ink blots in the test, would then be aware that there's some sort of problem that needs to be addressed or tested further. Now, if you talk to clinicians, psychologists, people who use the Rorschach ink blot test, it's one of the most frequently used tests we have in the field of psychology and psychiatry. But most people with whom I've spoken say that it is used as an icebreaker, maybe during that first therapy meeting, that it's a way of interacting with another person, breaking the ice, and seeing if there are any major issues that need to be addressed, although you don't yet know the nature of those problems based on a Rorschach test. This is more than you need to know, but there is a system, it's called the Exner system, that allows scientists, clinicians to empirically score responses on a Rorschach test. And as I understand it, the Exner system is very complicated, very difficult to use, very time consuming, and it is really not part of how this test is used typically. I should also point out that some Rorschach tests are in vivid colors, and some clinicians suggest that if a client who is taking the Rorschach test ignores the colors or overreacts to them, then that's an indication that the individual has some sort of difficulty with emotions. However, one of my favorite papers in the context of psychological assessment had to do with illusory correlates, correlations that were illusions in the minds of clinicians. And so at the time, this was decades ago, but at the time, many clinicians were using the Rorschach test and interpreting it in particular ways that were not based on empirical data, that were not based on science. For instance, many thought that seeing an animal in the Rorschach test that was composed of the parts of many different animals, for instance, the head of a lion, the legs of an elephant, that sort of thing, was indicative of homosexuality. And yet, when you do the research and you look at how people respond to Rorschach ink blot tests and whether or not they are homosexual or show the other characteristics that were illusory correlates, the answer is clear. These are not correlated with the responses of a Rorschach test. And so clinicians really need to be very careful when they use these tests not to make those kinds of assumptions. Essentially, those assumptions were based on their own clinical experiences, although one therapist with one group of clients is not going to have enough data to draw these conclusions. Another important projective test is the thematic apperception test, known as the TAT. And like the Rorschach test, the thematic apperception test uses ambiguous images. But if you look at the image on the screen, this image is not as ambiguous as an ink blot. However, it is ambiguous. If I ask you to look at a series of these types of images and tell me what's going on in the picture, describe events surrounding what you see, and point to the parts of the image that give rise to your impressions, then again, the idea is that you're going to reveal something about your own unconscious wishes, desires, motivations. And perhaps there is some truth to this. I'm aware of one research study where the researchers compared the thematic apperception test responses of people who were hungry, they haven't eaten for a while, with those of people who have eaten recently. And it turns out that when people were hungry, they haven't had a meal for a while, then there's more food imagery in their somatic apperception test responses. So, at least in the context of eating behavior, perhaps there's some validity to the thematic apperception test. Now, imagine that an individual takes the thematic apperception test and their responses to multiple of these images involves feeling inferior and overcoming that and then receiving a lot of social praise. For instance, if a person looks at one of these images and tells a story about a little boy who lived in a town where everybody ignored him and he never had any affection or attention, and then one day picked up a violin, and never having touched a violin before, he began to play beautifully, and everybody in town gathered around and they danced and they praised him. And if each of the thematic apperception test images reveals that type of situation, then it is very seductive to think that this is a core issue for the individual who's responding in that fashion. All right, now it's time to talk about intelligence testing. And this is a hot topic and a controversial topic today, and it pretty much has always been so. The very first intelligence test was designed by Alfred Binet in 1905. He was basically asked to generate a paper and pencil test that would identify children that needed extra assistance in the classroom in Paris at that time. And so no intelligence test had ever been designed before. How would you do this? What Alfred Binet did was to come up with a list of test items for children and identify the age at which children could typically perform each task. For instance, 3-year-olds can typically build towers of 3 blocks high. 4-year-olds can compare lines and say which one is longer. 6-year-olds can answer questions about why there are houses, why do we have books. 5-year-olds can copy a square. 8-year-olds can count from 20 to 0, essentially counting from 20 backwards. And 12-year-olds are adept with what are called verbal absurdities. For instance, Tom Jones' feet were so big he had to put his pants on over his head. That's an absurd statement, and a 12-year-old can identify it as absurd and explain why it's ridiculous. So Alfred Binet did this. He identified a series of tasks, the age at which children could perform those tasks. And he used this formula. IQ equals 100 times mental age divided by chronological age. And here, IQ represents intelligence quotient. And it's a formula in which there is literally a quotient, one number divided by another. Mental age divided by chronological age. So if a child's mental age is 6 and the child's chronological real age is 6, then it's 6 divided by 6, which is 1, times 100. So under these circumstances where mental age and chronological age are equal, the IQ would be 100. If the mental age is less than the chronological age, then the IQ would be less than 100. And if the mental age were greater than the chronological age, then the IQ would be greater than 100. Now, we no longer use this formula. I showed you the normal curve and I described the standardization process to you. So this formula is no longer in use. Important historically, you need to know it, but not in use today. And therefore, we really shouldn't be speaking of IQs or intelligence quotients because the standardization process today from a modern intelligence testing does not involve division or quotients. Now, Binet's test was modified in 1916 by Louis Terman, improved version of the test. And rather than naming it for himself, he named it after his university, and he was working out of Stanford University. So this intelligence test has come to be known as the Stanford Binet test, and it has in fact undergone many revisions since that time. And although intelligence testing is itself a controversial topic, intelligence tests are widely used today. There are two more types of intelligence tests that I want you to know: the WAIS and the WISC. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, that's the WAIS, and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, that's the WISC. So these were designed by David Wechsler back in the 30s and 40s, and he was highly critical of the intelligence tests as they existed at that time. He wanted to design intelligence tests that relied less on verbal ability because he thought that intelligence was more than verbal ability. So he basically designed the WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, to include more nonverbal items, essentially tests of performance. An example would be to look at a picture of a house and there's something missing in the image. Maybe the front door is gone even though there's a sidewalk leading up to the house. So according to Wechsler, responding to a test item like this one relies less on verbal ability, and he viewed intelligence as being far more than one's verbal capacity. In fact, when you score one of the Wechsler tests, there are two separate scores. One is for verbal ability and one is for performance on items like I've described. And as you read your textbook on intelligence testing, I think what you're going to see historically over time is that our definitions of intelligence have been broadening. Today, people speak of emotional intelligence, being able to look at other people's body language and facial expressions and understand their emotional states. The idea today, according to most psychologists, is that intelligence can involve a variety of different types of abilities that go well beyond verbal or even academic skills. Although intelligence tests are widely used today, there are some problems, and we all acknowledge this. For instance, intelligence testing can result in self-fulfilling prophecy. If a child is given an intelligence test and the parents and the teachers and maybe other family members and friends are told the results of that intelligence test, maybe it's lower than normal, then that could influence the child's behavior in the future. It can lead to self-fulfilling prophecy, or it could lead to self-fulfilling prophecy in the opposite direction, where a child and family are told that the test had high results, then that too could result in a self-fulfilling outcome. Intelligence test results can also be stigmatizing. And this means that, for instance, a child is given an intelligence test, maybe it's on the low side, and if people know about it, then from that moment on, other people in the child's life, the teachers, the family, will view the child through the filter of that low intelligence score. And that can be harmful and stigmatizing for a child. It can also, according to some people, be stigmatizing for a child to be identified as gifted, and that too could result in problems or uncomfortable situations for the child. Next, we need to question the reliability of intelligence tests. You know this vocabulary term, reliability. Reliability refers to whether or not a test yields consistent results. And decades ago, this was a serious problem with intelligence testing, that people could take the test one day and receive a score, and then it could be significantly different on another occasion. And so psychologists have worked hard to try to make intelligence tests more reliable. Never going to be perfect, but certainly there has been improvement. Last but not least, we should probably ask ourselves, what is intelligence? We design tests, we think we know what this word intelligence means, and we all have an intuitive idea anyway of what someone means when they say someone is intelligent or if they administer an intelligence test. But definitions of intelligence have changed over many, many years. The definitions of intelligence, as you read in your textbook, have become broader and broader to incorporate more and more diverse types of abilities. So I always think back to one thing that one of my college professors said that I've remembered all these years. He was a radical behaviorist, of course, so his view is not going to be typical of everyone's. But his definition of intelligence was this: intelligence is that which an intelligence test measures. I love that. Intelligence is that which an intelligence test measures. It takes into account the fact that our definitions of intelligence have changed historically over time, and that it is really just a hypothetical construct. We assume that there's some unitary thing in an individual that we call intelligence, and that that influences behavior, and that there's some distinct aspect of our personalities that we refer to as intelligence, and that it consistently influences our behavior. So, although there are some serious problems with intelligence testing, or there have been over the years, they're still frequently used today, and they actually can be very useful. For instance, even today, intelligence tests are used to identify children who need additional assistance in the classroom.